Yo, yo, ho, hey, yo. Ow! All right, welcome to Res Dog Walkers. 2007, we decided to build Nanwakolas Council. We had been in the discussions for the Great Bear, what turned out to be the Great Bear Rainforest, for about 10 years through different First Nations tribal councils. And tribal councils were very limiting. We weren't able to carry fiscal year funding over from year to year. And we couldn't build land use plans because we had to spend all of our money by the end of each year. And so the chiefs asked us to go build an organization that can help with the necessary capacity to deal with the Central Coast LRMP, which later got renamed as the Great Bear Rainforest. And so we built Nanwakolas Council, hoping to try build some capacity for First Nations to deal with resource management issues. We started off very small in 2007. We had a small contribution agreement with the province of British Columbia to do Land and Water Act referrals. And then we grew into dealing with forestry referrals. And then we grew into dealing with all land referrals that the province of British Columbia issues in our collective territories. And over those years, we've started to build various capacities. First, we started off with referrals officers, and then we brought in some land use planners, then we brought in some marine coordinators. And then we finally realized that we needed boots on the ground. It's one thing to develop plans and to build these plans. Every First Nations office has a shelf in a room that doesn't get used full of binders of all these plans that we've been part of the development of for so long. And we decided we needed to get beyond that. We needed to not only build plans, but we needed to see them implemented. And one of the things that was starting to catch on the coast of British Columbia, thanks to some of the efforts of North Coast nations like the Gitga'at and the Kitasoo, was guardian pilot programs. And so we watched with great interest as some of these other nations started to take out-of-work fishermen and be able to give them the opportunity to be some of that eyes and ears on the ground. In the beginning, it started off as a make work initiative to help fishermen get enough EI weeks so they'd be eligible for unemployment insurance after the fishing seasons got shorter and shorter. And then we realized that this is a tremendous opportunity to bring back something that sustained our people for thousands of years. We've always had a role for watchmen in our territories. We've always had someone who watched for friends, watched for enemies, watched for food, watched for just what the community need to be aware of. And over the colonization period, we lost a lot of that. We lost a lot of that connection to our lands and resources. We lost the ability to be out there and watch what was going on in our territories. And through a lot of the land use planning process in the Great Bear Rainforest, we were able to build some capacity to start to take on some of these initiatives. And we developed something called the Forestry Stewardship Network. And I'm so honored today to have as one of my first guests on the Res Dog Walkers podcast is my niece, Alexandra Thomas, who is the face of the Forestry Stewardship Network, if you will. You know, I could probably wax on poetically and gush a little bit because I'm so proud of the role that my niece has played in not only getting her education, but having that cultural background, because I know her grandmother was a matriarch of our family and she was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with her. But Alex, why don't you introduce yourself to us and let us know the role that you play for Nanwakolas, even though it's something that seems to change on a quarterly basis as we add more responsibilities onto your desk. But first, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for helping Uncle out on short notice. But why don't you introduce yourself to our group?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really honored to be here virtually. So my name is Alexandra Thomas, and I do currently work for the Nanwakolas Council. But to give a bit of background on myself and my knowledge base, I did grow up as a summer student guardian. So I did work for several years as a Clowitsees First Nation guardian, and I have to say it was one of the most incredible jobs to have. Just to kind of reflect on what Dallas said, I had never truly been in my territory or been able to physically be in a lot of places in my territory, and that was always difficult for me growing up because my grandmother herself had grown up, on Turner Island and had constantly been, with family, visiting family throughout the territory. And I didn't know this place at all. Myself, I currently live in Campbell River, born and raised in Campbell River. I have to say, working as a guardian has kind of brought me into this whole world of natural resource management. To also reflect further on my academic background, I've just graduated from the University of British Columbia with my undergraduate degree from the Faculty of Forestry. So it's it's not really a surprise that I'm pursuing this type of work, though my specific focus is now forestry. As a guardian, we don't really separate land and sea. All of the work that you do is in your territory. It's so focused on place and connecting yourself to that place and getting to know that place. As Dallas mentioned, that role of witnessing is so important when it comes to managing natural resources. And I can say that I've actually learned so much just from my couple summers of being a guardian compared to, a 5-year university degree. The difference in knowledge is really vast, but it's true. Land-based knowledge is something that you can't acquire any other way. And I really think that's kind of what helped me get through my degree, is because I had a unique understanding of how connection to place really needs to drive your decision making. And in that way, you're not, neglecting your responsibilities to take care of things because you know them so intimately. So I've worked with Nanwakolas for the past year or so, and as I'm sure we'll discuss further, I've worked on a bunch of different projects in different arenas, but I really do like to uphold the Stewardship Network just because I have worked as a guardian. I'm beyond proud of all the guardians today. I know a lot of them quite well, and I work often with them. And I just think they have the coolest jobs in the world, and I want to do everything that I can to support that. So that's really the role of people who work at Nanwakolas. So it suits me just fine.
It's been great to have you come on board because you brought an energy to the team that has been quite noticeable. We work in this world of, we start answering to government this, government that, and we kind of forget about the big picture sometimes of how are we grounded in the reality that's existing out there. And I think you've brought a exuberance and energy to that I'm definitely noticing throughout Nanwakolas now. So, some of the projects that the Guardians undertake, it's endless. When in the early stages, while we're still trying to secure long-term funding, which is one of the initiatives that, Merv and myself are working on a regular basis, is we chase a lot of grants, which have us doing some field work and then writing some reports. And there's kind of this monotony of things moving along. But we also have some pillar projects that I think have helped shown the need for the Guardian program beyond that, showing that we need full-time 365-day-a-year presence in our territories. And one of the ones that, I'm biased because in some rooms I claim it was my idea, was the large cultural cedar program. I remember when Dinukdao was building their new Gyuksy in Zazi in New Vancouver on Harbledown Island, and we couldn't find corner posts. The Dinukdao come from Knight Inlet. It's a vast area that should be full of tremendous forest resources, but 100 years of poor industrial activity have put that nation in a position where they had to go hat in hand to one of their neighbors and find some suitable logs to build their big house. And so thankfully, we were able to work something out with Owakino, and we were able to get the logs down there, and they built the house, and it's been used for several potlatches, and it's part of the cornerstone of the community now. But it made us realize that if that's happening to one of our communities, a lot of our communities can't be that far off from not being able to find suitable cultural wood existing within. And so we started talking about this large cultural cedar program. And again, it's one thing to build some policy and go to the companies and say, you're going to do this and you're going to tell us about this. But if we don't actually have guardians with those boots on the ground and witnessing what's going on out there, these programs aren't really that implementable. So why don't you explain the LCC program a little bit and just the role that you play in it on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm quite personally attached to the project. So LCC, you're going to hear it a million times, large cultural cedar. Another name that people, might think or associate with large cultural cedar is monumental cedars. They kind of have similar parameters, I'm going to say. So the whole intention of the project really, or I should say protocol, is that our nations declared that, as Dallas has outlined, we need these unique large cedar trees. They don't just, pop out of the ground and appear. They are the accumulation of, 600-700 years of growth in unique habitats that aren't the same anymore. Um, and I think it's really humbling just to kind of acknowledge and reflect on that. Industrial logging hasn't even been around as long as these trees have been growing. But for us and our people, they have been important for so long. Cedar have been, growing here in this coastal environment for the past 4,000 to 5,000 years, and we've adapted our entire culture around them. Myself, you can probably tell I'm really passionate about cedar, and I will probably be focusing on them later, my later years, maybe a graduate study. I'm not sure yet, but that's one of the reasons that the LCC, or Large Cultural Cedar protocol, is so important to me. We've outlaid the parameters of the types of trees that we want protected and why, because it's not just about them being big trees or old trees. It's about the quality of wood that they can actually provide for our communities. So, for example, if you are building a big house or you want to carve a totem pole or masks, you can't just cut down a log and hope it's not rotten. You have to make sure that you've actually inventoried the tree and you've made sure that it's in good quality, that it's round shape, that it, doesn't have any cracks or growing weird on a slope. And that requires intimate knowledge of the land and where that tree's growing. So to give reference to, how I'm connected to this project, I personally have walked, we call them LCC surveys. I've walked quite a few of them all over the member nation territories, and I've been guardians in LCC surveys. And it gets back to that role of the guardians and why it's so important for them to have those place-based skills. Is you're walking around your territory and you're trying to find the remnants of these old growth ecosystems that produce these massive trees. And essentially we put them into an inventory with the survey. And then that's our plan for the future, is that we have this inventory now that we can search through. Anytime, our member nations need a big tree for something important, whether it be ceremonial, whether it be to build a big house or a totem pole, they can come to us, and we actually have access to information about where these trees are, how big they actually are, if it's red or yellow cedar, if it's cypress. And I think this is just, us getting on track of how we used to manage land. So in my opinion, a lot of our current day land management, we're looking at the next 100 years at max. And I don't think that's enough. I don't think that is a long enough timescape when you're talking about trees that you want them to be around 600 to 700 years old. And, we haven't even begun to understand, can we grow those types of trees again? Are we planting cedar trees today that will become old growth forest? So these are questions that I've always kind of had, and I like to bring up when I talk about large cultural cedar, just so people get the idea of how significant these trees are and just how significant this project is. To summarize, Guardians currently walk LCC surveys every month of the year, as long as they can get to the place that they need to be at, in conjunction with forest companies. And what they do is they go out and they survey all the trees in proposed logging blocks, so that they can make sure that those trees are completely protected from ongoing logging activities and then preserved for the future. So yeah, I just think that this project is really a cornerstone of how we'd like to move forward with our land management in more of a long-term way. And we actually make sure that our future descendants from the member nations will have access to large trees. So yeah, thanks for asking about it, Alice.
No, and that brings up a couple things that pop to mind right away is not only the need for recruitment, because as you said, these trees just don't pop up. And so it's important for us to establish that sort of baseline, or reestablish that baseline, as you said, about how we traditionally managed things for thousands of years, to a point where we're getting back in the driver's seat and able to have that 7-generation vision. And, it bugs me that sometimes that terminology gets stereotyped a little bit, but we really have to think beyond the next 100 years. I know I got Dr. Melanie Clapham joining me this afternoon as well, and we started off with some short-term goals around grizzly bear management, and she helped us realize that if we don't establish long-term goals, the short-term goals aren't really going to be reachable anyway. But it also brings me a little chuckle. Nanwakolas built a canoe, and I managed to get the province to pay for it, but then I convinced them that I'd give it to them. And so we built a canoe kind of in commemoration with our working relationship with the province. And we actually gave it to them on International Forestry Day at the 2010 Olympics. And so we had a nice ceremony where we paddled with Coast Guard escort, had the canoe come in, and I built this really wobbly, tippy canoe that no one really wanted to get in. So it was a good thing we gifted it to them, and it's now being stored at the Vancouver Convention Center in the West Lobby. And so it's nice to see that there. But the story that you just talked about, knowing that a log's going to be good enough for a traditional use, we had to go through 8 logs before we found that one, because we didn't have a cultural cedar inventory. We didn't have a monumental cedar inventory. So we went out and dropped 8 big trees and had them helicoptered in at great expense, because the province was behind us and the forest companies were behind the PR that was going to come from this collaborative effort. And we had the blessing, we had the log there, and we brought George Hunt in, Chief George Hunt, to come bless it. Chief Bill Cramner, who just recently passed away, was there. We had a number of, dignitaries from the province and local communities. And so we blessed the log and we get it to the workshop where they're putting it, and they stuck the chainsaw in the end for the first cut, and the whole tree just blew up. And so if I build a new canoe, I'm going to make sure I consult you on the log that we pick first. So maybe add that to your list of to-dos, is finding us a suitable canoe log for Knight Inlet Lodge. But I'm trying to figure out where to go on this, just from the personal interest sake of just watching the next generation start to take their rightful place. You and I come from a very traditional family. We've been potlatching since time immemorial. During the ban, my great-grandfather, his brother still potlatched when it was in Prohibition. We've been told the stories of how these potlatches would happen in Turner when the weather was really bad, so the RCMP wouldn't go raid and different things like that. And so it's interesting for me, as someone who just sort of got thrusted into First Nations leadership, to see you take the other path and get educated and bring that skill set back to our community. Tell me what it means to you just to be able to, I don't want to say give back like you owe us anything, but what does it mean to you to sort of just be part of making something a little bit better?
Yeah. Well, you did mention a bit about our family background, so I'll elaborate on that a little bit. My grandma, being who she was a very traditional person, but I didn't acknowledge or really know that when I was young. That's my grandma. It's what I was accustomed to. But in reality, a lot of our elders hold the teachings, that they've always known, their traditional knowledge very close. And it really, dictates how they behave and how they treat one another. And I really have to, lift my grandma up and admit that I wouldn't be who I am today without her, and how she raised me. She was very supportive as I was a kid. I was her only grandchild. So obviously there was a spotlight on me. But the morals and the teachings that she passed on to me are really what's helped guide my life. And I would say responsibility is one of the biggest ones that I carry. And I'm going to try to explain it in a cultural sense. responsibility doesn't mean necessarily giving back as if you owe anything, as Dallas said. It means that you acknowledge your role in your community. So for me, the reason I pursued forestry and I pursued an education, and I'm still pursuing further education, is because it's my responsibility for these things that I'm interested in and I'm passionate about to learn about them and to be a leader or decision maker in those spaces and to be informed. Um, and that's just, my role. And I really feel like I'm learning to fulfill that. And it really gives me purpose. And that's what I really encourage a lot of other Indigenous youth to pursue, not specifically forestry, but something that, fills their life with purpose and helps them find their role in their community. And there are so many things that we need in our communities. I know everybody kind of says lawyers, doctors, but even things like natural resources, we need people who are educated in these things. We need people to bring our perspectives and our teachings into these spaces where they've never been before. I didn't actually learn about Indigenous science or Indigenous worldviews until, the last bit of my degree. And it's something I'm going to keep pursuing because it's a quote unquote new field, but it's not new. We've always been here and we've always been scientists and doctors and healers and dancers and singers. And we've always had these things in our societies, but I think it's totally valid to leave your community and to go out and learn more about the world and to come back and share what you've learned. So it's a little bit of that all mixed together that really kind of led my decisions. I've also just, been raised by a very strong, independent woman as well. So it just seems to be in our bloodline that's how we're going to do things. And it really helps having mentors and family supports along the way. Like I know Dallas has always kept track of what I was doing with my life when I was growing up. He's like, oh, what are you up to now? Constantly bugging me, but reminding me that I had people who cared and who just genuinely wanted to know what I wanted. Yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
No, this is tremendous. I could do this all day. Watching you grow up is funny because I was at Uncle Thomas's in my dad's house a couple weeks ago, and my baby daughter was using your high chair that, we had so many Christmas dinners around. So it's kind of neat seeing this circle not close, but continue. And in the right way. We talk about breaking chains and breaking some of the things that have hurt our people, but I don't think we do enough to lift up some of the good things that we're continuing to do. And that's the passing down of knowledge and a need for people to understand that accountability you talked about of your role within a community. So one more thing, as I see we're starting to get close to time, but talk about the Hamaya Stewardship Network. Like I said, when it began, it was something we were doing to try just keep people working, and then it grew into so much more. It brought back the role of watchmen and witnesses and those sorts of things. But I know you're knee-deep involved in both the ongoing work of the existing Guardians, but also the STTP program. So maybe give me just a couple minutes of your thoughts between STTP and the Guardian program and the evolution curve that it kind of continues to go on.
Yeah. So how my connection kind of started to this is I started with was that I was a guardian. I was a summer student guardian, as it's important to make that distinction, as everybody did to me when I started working. I got all the horrible jobs, of course. Is that, there are multiple different roles to guardian crews. So every crew has a manager, but we've been really encouraging young folks to come up the ranks and to join our guardians, whether that just be as a summer student for one summer, or whether that be to actually take the SDTP course and actually learn all of the skills that could help them, build a career out of this. As I mentioned multiple times, I said it's the coolest job ever, but I'll elaborate on why I think that. So the Guardians is, kind of a way that we can create our traditional roles into a modern day job. So traditionally in our villages and our communities, we had people who already did the things that Guardians do, who monitor salmon, who are out walking through the forest, like I said, LCC surveying, um, or who are making sure our estuaries are healthy, who are aware and watching the bears and seeing how they are doing. And those are things that the guardians do every single day, and every single day is different. And I think that for our people, this kind of job is just revolutionary in the way that it's so healing to be on your land, to be connecting with your land, to be fulfilling traditional roles that you are just well suited to. If you love being outside, which I can assure you practically every guardian does, then you're there all year. You're out there in the summer, you're out there in the winter, you're there in the fall. You're watching the rivers change and the leaves fall and grow again. It seems like we're talking about cycles kind of naturally here, but I'm trying to give visuals on just how much it changes you as a person, in so many good ways. You learn so many different new things. And the role of the STTP program is to prepare students who might not have any experience working in the outdoors or working in resource management, a little bit of toolbox of skills that they can carry out there, so they don't feel like they're kind of thrust into the deep end. But really anybody could and can and should be a guardian if they want to be. I'm really here to advocate for women to be guardians. It just seems that there's a lot less women who work on the land, and I really want to advocate and let them know that it is a wonderful space for them to be and that we need them there. But also young people. As you touched on, the cycle of generations, we're kind of seeing it come full circle. I'm really hoping to see more of my young cousins get full-time jobs as guardians and really have that connection to the territories. I know I always have that connection, and I'm always going to find my way to sneak out there and work in the field as much as I can. But I really hope that more and more of them, see that opportunity and seize it and go, oh, I can do this. This is something that, is brought to my community. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to move anywhere. I can, work from grandma's house if I want to and still stay there and support her. I think that accessibility is so important because for a lot of our communities, that's the biggest struggle for young people is they don't want to leave. They don't want to move across the country to go get an education. And I can't blame them. Why would you want to move away from that support network? To touch further on the program, I think it's nothing but exploding. We're going to have so many more guardians in the next decade, and I can't wait for that because it just seems like the work is never ending. And I don't say that in a negative way. I think there are so many things that our guardians can give insight to that other people cannot. I think that we're really opening doors for new ways to do research, just as we'll kind of hear from Melanie. Working with First Nations in their own territories respectfully and following their protocols on how to do things is the new way to do research. And I think that with the Guardian programs, we're really bridging that gap. You are working with the local experts and knowledge holders who know everything about their territories. So instead of, going out there with just a question and not being really well informed, you already have this giant pool of knowledge from these people who have been working out there. So I really think that in the future, we're going to have twice as many guardians, and there's going to be twice as many projects. That's really what I see. I see Nanwakolas exploding as well, because as I described earlier, our role is to support them. And to do so, we need more capacity. We need more people on board as well. But that's nothing but a good thing. It means that our communities really can move mountains, and we can, change the way things are being done and have it be done our traditional way. And I really encourage anybody who's interested in any of this to get involved, to learn about the Guardian program, to reach out to Nanwakolas to learn more. We really want our communities to actually be passionate about these things and to be engaged. And that's a large part of my role, trying to talk about the Haumea Stewardship Network, is to, let people know you can get involved in this. Anybody can get involved. And that's the whole role, is that it's for our community in our territories. And I think that's just kind of the slogan that I will repeat again and again to anybody who asks.
I think you're well on your way to helping us do that growth that we're talking about. I know, we had the commitment from Prime Minister Trudeau last December at COP15 for the $800 million in funding to the 4 PFPs, with the Great Bear Sea being one of them. And so it's important, as we look to long-term funding solutions, that we understand what that growth is going to be and what the potential is going to be there. So I wish you the best of luck in that. I got 2 quick questions before we wrap up. Who are you playing soccer for now, and how's that going? I know soccer is a big part of your life. I think it's great that you have that competitive thing to just sink your teeth into, to kind of take you away from the rest of the stuff that you're managing and dealing with at a regular time. So who are you playing soccer for now, and what's your schedule look like this year?
Oof, my schedule is actually a normal person's schedule for once. I only have one job and one volunteer project, which I'd be happy to tell people about at another time. I am currently playing soccer for Squamish United. Please don't judge me, but I do have some cousins who are very near and dear to my heart who play for Squamish United. And I probably will be transferring to a Vancouver Island team, so you don't need to be angry about my loyalties for much longer. And I just have to say, Liverpool is definitely the best Premier League team. That's my final comment on soccer.
I'm so glad you went there, because it wouldn't be Res Dog Walkers if we didn't bring some little bit of controversy into it. Being from the family that we're from is not enough of a lightning rod for challenges and things like that. But then the other question I have is, you and James Hogan racing up a mountain to a CMT or something. I picture you blowing his doors off the first couple 100 yards, but does he keep up? Is he pretty spry out there?
You know what? Everybody brings this up about racing in the woods. James and I are very safety oriented, and how it works is I will go about, 50 to 100 meters ahead of him, and then I will sit down and eat a snack and drink some water, and then he catches up to me, and then we recover, and then he goes ahead, I go ahead again, and it just repeats. But we're safety oriented. No one gets left behind. I don't leave James at the bottom of the mountain.
With a diplomatic answer like that, I don't think we could have found a better person to be the face of the Hamaya Stewardship Network. I want to thank you not only for the contributions you make to the family, to Nanwakolas, but I just wish you the best of luck on everything that you're trying to achieve, not just on behalf of Nanwakolas Council, but for your career and your place in the community. And I want to thank you again for being on, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Alex.
Ayla Kessler, thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. It was great to have you on the show today, just to talk about not only where we were, but where we're going, and a little bit on how we're going to get there. Which really brings us to our next guest, Dr. Melanie Clapham. She's been instrumental in helping us just understand everything that it takes to get into the discussion around wildlife viewing, specifically around grizzly bears. In 2017, Nanwakolas Council bought Knight Inlet Lodge, and Dr. Melanie Clapham was doing her research studies there, and has grown to be a prominent member of the Nanwakolas team, and helping us not only understand the habits of grizzly bears, but what kind of policy we need to put in place as ecotourism and wildlife viewing and all these other great opportunities that are in front of our nation start to present themselves. We need to make sure that we have a sustainable framework in place to help us implement them. So it's a great pleasure to have you on today, Mel. As I said, as you started to learn from Nanwakolas when we acquired Knight Inlet Lodge a few years back, and the work of the Hamaya Stewardship Network and all the various things that we're working on, we find out that it's not really slanted in the direction of one thing or the other. It's about growing the professional expertise of First Nations communities to implement opportunities, whether that be in the protection or development of resources. And our paths got to cross when we bought Knight Inlet Lodge, and you were doing some biology work out there. So why don't you give us a quick introduction about yourself and how our paths came to cross from your start of the discussion?
Yeah, of course. Gila Kessler, thank you for having me today, Dallas. Yeah, always a pleasure to come and talk with you and talk about some of the work that we've been doing. So I've been working with Knight Inlet Lodge, now owned by Nanwakolas, since about 2009. So I was a graduate student and I came across from the UK to come and study grizzly bears in Knight Inlet. So my PhD research was focused on social behavior of grizzly bears. I spent a lot of time watching bears, using technologies like remote cameras to study them and observe them, and really start to collect data to try and inform some conservation and management decisions as well. So, like I say, a lot of our research uses things like cameras, different types of technologies. We've also done research using genetics to look at relatedness of the local population of bears. And I've also worked quite closely with the lodge to look at studies to assess human impacts on bears as well. So that's been one of the kind of priorities of Knight Inlet Lodge, is to try and ensure that bear viewing opportunities, or the bear viewing industry that takes place isn't having a negative impact on bears, or is having as least amount of impact as possible. So I've done some work, myself and colleagues, looking at behavioral studies to assess impacts on bears, looking at their spatial use of areas when there's bear viewing, or their temporal use, so whether they change the time of day when they're active, things like that. So a lot of my work has been to try and to get a better understanding of bear behavior, so we can take that into consideration when we are developing management plans and other types of management for them.
It's been interesting getting to know you and the field over the years. We've dealt with grizzly bear management from a exercise of theory through the Great Bear Rainforest. We've looked at a lot of studies that, in those days, Tony Hamilton seemed to be the only guy who knew anything about grizzly bears for the province. And we kind of took bear habitat into consideration during the development of the Great Bear Rainforest land use planning agreements. But when we bought Knight Inlet Lodge, it took a completely different meaning for us in what we needed to understand from a cultural significance. Obviously, grizzly bears are iconic in the Kwakwaka'wakw culture, not even go as far as to say coastal First Nations culture. But then having to understand what you just talked about, the impacts on the business that we developed, because I know as we're starting to get away from a resource extractive economy, or at least solely from a resource extractive economy, it's not as simple as just saying, let it set up wildlife viewing and do these sorts of things, because there's impacts with whatever you're doing in a certain ecosystem and habitat. So having you come along, and then, the students that you have working with you, I've been fortunate enough to go out to, Knight Inlet Lodge. I get out there 3-4 times a year, and the really good ones are when you're out there with one of your teams. So I don't have to go with all the tourists and take away from their experience. I get to hop in a boat with you, and Brando will take us across to the other side, and I'll just learn something more about bears. How many bears do you think you've seen in Knights Inlet over the last 13, 14 years?
Oh, gosh, it's so difficult to know, like, across the years. I know in a single year, one year, we documented over 80 different individuals. So really high density. And that really comes down to kind of the habitat. So like you were saying, so Glendale Cove has got some great grizzly bear habitat. It's a salmon spawning creek. So we have a big return of pink salmon and a smaller return of chum salmon. And then there's a big intertidal zone as well. So that's really important, especially in the spring and the summer. And then there's a huge estuary meadow as well. So again, that's really important food for them. So it really makes, for grizzlies, they have access to food pretty much for their whole active period in that area. So we think that's one of the reasons why we do have a higher density in that site compared to some other places. We also see quite a lot of females with cubs that bring their cubs into Glendale as well. So we kind of consider it a bit of an area too. So again, one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment, working with Nanwakolas and the Guardian programs as well, is to try to understand important areas and important types of habitat. We think we have a good idea of the habitat requirements that grizzly bears have, but we want to know this on like a local scale. We really want to get to the bottom of where are the really important river systems, or where is the really important areas in the nation's territories, so that we can start to say, okay, what do we need to do? Are there specific things we need to do on the ground to conserve or include within management plans and land use plans to ensure that these areas that are important for bears are protected and conserved into the future?
You brought up a couple points that I want to pick up upon, because I'm one of these guys. When we started Nanwakolas, there was myself, Merv Child, and we had a $150,000 contribution agreement, to a point now where we have 35 trained guardians. We have, 24 different consultants helping us in various levels of land use planning, both marine and terrestrial. We have a referral staff of half a dozen people. And I'm a big believer in, as we've developed capacities and tools, is to use them. So I know I give you, like we did for this podcast interview, I kind of give you 2.5 days notice for when I need something from you. Some of the facial recognition work you're doing has been helping us when bears have made it to Vancouver Island and have potentially been deemed problem bears. We've been able to use some of the technology that you've developed in partnership with some of the colleagues. Maybe tell us a little bit about that facial recognition work that you've been helping out with.
Yeah, so this is kind of one of our main focal projects that we're working on at the moment. We actually have a separate research organization that I established a couple of years ago with a few colleagues, called the Bear ID Project. So basically, the premise is to develop non-invasive technologies to help us to study bears and to monitor them. So by non-invasive, I mean ideally technologies which don't require us to capture bears and attach collars or other types of devices to them. So data that we can collect kind of remotely, as we would call. So these are called low or non-invasive technologies. So camera traps are a great example, or collecting little bits of their fur through genetic tagging remotely is another example. But we really think that camera traps hold a lot of promise. So like image-based data, so taking a photograph of a bear and trying to understand as much as we can about it from that one photograph, so we can identify that it's a grizzly bear. We can manually say, okay, what kind of age does this bear appear to be? What's its age class? Is it a juvenile? Is it a subadult? Is it an adult? We can hopefully sex the bear, male or female, and then hopefully we can identify the individual as well. So those are all things that we currently do kind of manually. When we're going through camera trap footage, every video that we collect of a bear, we go through and we try and look at all those different things. And of course, it can be very difficult to do. It can take a long time, especially the individual ID part. Some bears can be new to an area in 1 year. We might not be sure if we've seen them before. So what we kind of do is we set up like a database of footage of the different bears that are seen on cameras. And then over time, we start to add images to those for those specific individuals. And that's how, and then they become, and then we have specific numbers for them. Some of the bears even have like identifier names. Usually something that's kind of, specific about them, if they've got a limp or if they've got like a notch in the ear, some kind of descriptor about them. But it can be very difficult to identify that same bear over time. And these bears do change a lot as well, especially on the coast. They come out of their dens and they've got their big thick winter coats. And then during the summer months, they shed that outer fur, and they can look very lean. They can look very slim. And so that is basically because, they do lean down a little bit in the summertime, but they've got a very thin coat. And then they begin to put weight on in the fall and regrow that coat. So kind of at 3 times a year, they can look very different. So that kind of led us to thinking, is it possible to develop more of like an objective way to be able to identify individual bears and therefore study them? And could that help us to study bears in ways that we haven't done before? So for example, at the moment, for some species where individual animals can be identified on cameras, we can do population assessments. So a thing called mark recapture. So a type of like ecological analysis where we work out how many individuals or what the density of individuals is in a specific area. But to be able to do that, you have to be able to recognize individuals and distinguish individuals. So at the moment, we're only really able to do that using like genetics, or in the past through capturing bears. So if we can develop technologies to identify individuals in a way that's objective and accurate and robust, then it kind of opens the toolbox that we can use to be able to study and monitor them. And that's kind of how the Bear ID project came about. So we wanted to try and look at ways to identify individual bears. And because they change over time so much, we kind of looked towards facial recognition techniques as a way to be able to potentially identify them. And then I started working with 2 software developers that I met down. They're based in the States. And collectively, we formed the Bear ID project. And we've been kind of working on it ever since to develop artificial intelligence models using this process called machine learning to be able to automatically detect a bear's face in an image, and then to be able to recognize that individual bear and match it to other individuals that are in our current database. So we started off with still images from photographs that I'd taken in Glendale Cove, and that some of the guides that worked for Knight Inlet Lodge had taken as well. So we kind of had a bit of a citizen science approach there. We were also collecting images from guests at the lodge as well. And collectively then we pulled all that together, and we developed a model that could identify bears from just their faces. And now this next stage that we're moving on to now is to identify them in camera trap videos, because that's what we think holds the real promise to be able to study them. So there's big opportunities to research, monitor them. And then, as you were mentioning before, Dallas, there's big opportunities in relation to kind of more practical conservation we might want to think about in terms of trying to reduce things like human-bear conflicts. If we can recognize individual bears, we can determine how many bears we have in an area. And Vancouver Island is a great example because, we have seen some bears swimming across from the mainland, and there's a lot of uncertainty around how many different bears there are. And because these bears can look very different at different times of years, sometimes the numbers can become inflated. So what we want to know is we want to have, a good understanding of the number of different bears, perhaps that are coming across, where they're coming from. And that can help us to start to understand why these bears may be moving into areas where they haven't been in at least recent history.
It's interesting. Again, it goes into another tangent. It's helped us with some of our land use planning, because now we're having to take the fact that bears are part of an ecosystem on Vancouver Island now. We're not sure what we can do to mitigate that, but the more we can understand it, puts us in the best position to continue working with government around making sure we set some policy that makes sure that bears inhabiting an area aren't necessarily deemed a dangerous bear and put down. We remember talking about Molly, the bear that was caught up in some of the media sensation, and just trying to find the right path forward. Unfortunately, some more collaboration may have led to a better result. Only the creator knows, I guess, but we're learning more and more about how far spread the bear issue is. A lot of us like to think that bears just stay in one watershed in one area, and we're starting to understand through some of the camera traps and some of these things that the areas that they roam upon starting to expand, and that's probably a number of reasons. I mean, you're the expert. You talked about the food security that exists in Glendale Cove with the sedge and some of that stuff that they really value until the salmon return. But it's just interesting trying to understand how far it goes out beyond that. And so that leads to kind of the discussion around what does successful wildlife viewing look like, specifically around grizzly bears. I know since I've become a lodge owner or a representative of the lodge ownership group, we've paid very close attention to how the industry is starting to evolve. And we've obviously had some concerns because everything as it's starting has challenges because no one's got rules in place. No one understands what some of the best practices are. And that's why I'm so proud to be part of Knight Inlet Lodge and have a relationship with the Kitaksu Hey and Spirit Bear Lodge up in the North Coast, where we're just able to share a lot more information about making sure we set a bar that's appropriate for the areas that we're working in right now. And I guess one of the examples I'll use is, you have guided tours where people pay significant dollars. It's kind of a bucket list thing for a lot of people from, your homeland. We've got a lot of European clientele at Knight Inlet Lodge. I believe it's upwards of 80% European clientele. And so these people are coming over and they're paying for this experience, but also with the change of the economics of the coast and fishing shutting down and different things shutting down, more people are trying to be entrepreneurs around wildlife viewing, which, as someone who's been trying to build employment opportunities, I fully support. But there has to be some frameworks in place to make sure that we're not negatively impacting the bears that are going to provide this new opportunity of economic development for us. I think of some of the things that I've seen just out at Knight Inlet, where, I won't say fly-by-nighters, but people who are unregistered, unlicensed, don't have the investment that a lot of us other operators have, are showing up with gas station sandwiches and they're crinkling these goddamn containers as they're pulling into the estuary. You're like, what is that noise? There's pure silence. And then you hear someone opening a sandwich wrapper. And it just goes against everything that we preach at our lodge. So maybe just give us a quick run through of just some of the things that could lead towards some best practices around wildlife viewing.
Yeah, and just as you were talking, I'm just thinking about how subtle bear behavior can sometimes be. So it can be very overt sometimes, like if a boat approaches a bear too quickly, or even humans approach bears off, but sometimes they'll just run. Sometimes we call that like displacement. So that bear or that animal has been displaced from that area, probably because of the behavior of the humans. So especially if it's, a boat directly approaching them, not going slowly, not thinking about things like wind direction, or maybe, like you say, not keeping their voices down. So there's lots of different practices and protocols that we can abide by, and that have been consistently used by Knight Inlet Lodge since the management plan was first in place. So I think that began about late 90s. So it's consistent, predictable behavior is always the key around grizzlies. So they become aware of kind of what to expect from people. And over time, they can habituate to that. As long as people don't get too close, as long as people aren't feeding bears or aren't negatively impacting them. So we want to fall somewhere in between those two things. We want to have like a neutral response so that bears don't necessarily always run away and see us as a huge threat, but they aren't also attracted to us because they don't think we're going to give them, food or something like that. So we want to remain somewhere in the middle where we can coexist, peacefully with bears and alongside bears, and they can do the same and they can still have access to food. We're not displacing them from this really important feeding area. And this isn't just for Glendale. This is lots of other river systems on the coast, if there is bear viewing or even land-based, or even just human activity in general. We want to make sure that those bears have access to that site, that food, because as we said earlier, we are seeing, fluctuations in returns of salmon and things like that. It's becoming more and more difficult for bears to access the amount of food that they need. So we need to make sure that they can sustain themselves and keep access to important feeding areas. So as I say, there's kind of really overt behavior that bears can display if they are affected by human presence, like running away, or sometimes, bluff charging. If they feel so threatened and there's people nearby, they can do things like call the bluff charge, which is to try and encourage you to move away from them and to let you know that you've kind of encroached into their personal space. But then there's also lots of subtleties, and people that haven't studied bear behavior or aren't, aware of these subtleties may not know. So even just things like scratching, I see so many pictures and videos of bears posted online where the bear is like looking at the camera and scratching or yawning. And we know from research that these are subtle signs of stress or anxiety in bears and other wildlife. So if you're watching a bear and it's yawning and it's scratching and it's staring at you, it's not just sleepy and itchy. It's probably the fact that actually you're affecting its behavior. And when it's doing these behaviors, it's not doing things like feeding or sleep or resting and things like that. So it's taking time away from important behaviors that they have to do to sustain themselves. And so if we're seeing this repeated behavior from people around bears over time, it could have quite a detrimental effect on that individual, but also on bears' use of that area too. So to try and avoid that, we need to make sure that bear viewing and other types of activities are sustainable and they're sustainably managed, and they are managed with things like management plans that have things like, timings of when viewing's taking place or behavior of people around bears. We don't take any food when we're out in boats viewing bears or even on land. So we try and reduce the of conflict with bears as much as possible and try to promote coexistence by putting those types of measures in place.
That's we could talk about this for hours, and I look forward to it. I know, you and I literally did that. I believe it was a cold April weekend when you and I got together out at Knight Inlet Lodge for a filming of The Nature of Things for David Suzuki, and it was interesting. We had the same conversation probably 12 times in a boat, in a truck, on the side of the dock. But I think that's what's necessary. I think it's important for First Nations governments to continue to build capacity to help the public understand why we're building some frameworks and why we're making some of the land use decisions that we're making because of iconic species like the grizzly bears. Have you noticed, I guess, as I see our time starting to wrap up, you talked about, making sure that we're noticing these things and understanding some of these reactions and some of these impacts. What have you seen firsthand as someone who's been there, since 2009, since 2010, in the last 5-6 years as we've introduced the Hamaya Stewardship Network, as we started to have guardians out at the lodge? What do you see the potential in that? I'd just love to hear some comments as someone who was there before we got involved, to seeing the level of First Nations kind of getting involved both on the ground, at a policy level, and even politically, to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect these opportunities in this species.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been incredible. Just on the ground from a Glendale Cove perspective, like the Donetdale Guardians were out in boats kind of monitoring human behavior, monitoring boats that are coming into the cove and Knight Inlet in general, ensuring appropriate behavior, speaking to people that are coming into their territory, welcoming them, but also saying, this is a managed area. We expect you to behave in certain ways. And there's, leaflets that they hand out that outline some of these principles. And what's great now is we even see people, as they're coming into Glendale, they radio for the Guardians. So they know that is expected to get in touch with the Guardians when they come into this area. So that's fantastic. So we can kind of set the standard, or the Guardians can set that standard from the get-go. And then I've also had the privilege of working really closely with the Guardians on grizzly bear monitoring and research as well. So as you mentioned earlier, we've been setting up camera traps in a much broader area that covers Nanwakolas member nation territories, and working with each Guardian program so that, we can look at bear movement and, presence and behavior within each nation's territory, but also between them as well. So we're starting to learn, by working with the Guardians, we're starting to learn more about movement of bears across territorial boundaries. And a lot of the Guardians have been really surprised, and myself as well, when we've seen the amount of space that these bears can cover. And so we can almost track them on these different cameras. And that's one of our aims working with the Guardians, is to be able, and Bear ID technology, is to be able to kind of combine the two so that, Guardians can set out their camera traps so we can remotely monitor them, and we can see where these different bears are going and start to understand a little bit more. So huge contribution to knowledge of bear distribution and bear movement within and across territories there. And I feel like we're just getting started with that work as well. So even though we've already been doing it for a few years already, there's so much potential. And we're understanding so much more about bears on a kind of on a landscape scale. I was going to say on a local scale, but it isn't when working with Guardians now. It is on a landscape scale, whereas before it was more on individual river systems. So again, we're learning more about this whole area by working in collaboration with the Guardians.
Nice. And I'm not going to lie, I wish the leadership would collaborate as well as the Guardians do. I've really been privileged to see the Guardians start to play the role, but coordinate with each others from the various nations. And, you know, I think we're on the right path, and I really want to thank you for your contribution to the efforts of Nanwakolas Council and the bear community, and again, appreciate your willingness to jump off a bridge on short notice for me and join us today. So I want to thank you, Dr. Clapham, for being here today, and we look forward to having you on Res Dog Walkers again, maybe during bear season.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dallas. It's been a privilege to be on your first episode. And yeah, look forward to coming back on.
Thank you so much to our guests, Alex and Melanie, for being on the show today. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in. Don't miss out on the 9th BC Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, coming soon to Nanaimo, BC, April 24th to 26th, 2024. Since the beginning of the conference series, many successful partnerships now exist that bring significant benefits to First Nations, resource developers, businesses, and all levels of government. BC IROC lays the foundation for future partnerships and benefits for First Nations in the resource sector. Visit our website at www.bciroc.ca to learn more. And again, I just want to thank our guests for joining us today. We look forward to not only having them return, but have others come and share just that different point of view around their role in resource development and resource management. I really look forward to kind of putting the gears to a few of my guests who I have the luxury of being able to do that to because of my personal relationship. But I also look forward to bringing in people new to myself to just help share some of the knowledge that people have accrued around First Nations and resource management. Thanks a lot.
Hey yo, 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 ho, hey yo.